and an exhibit from the Healdsburg Museum. In the case to your right, my left. On the 25th of October is our next talk, and that should be a humdinger, as is tonight. We are going to have a panel of 4 gentlemen who can relate stories of the Prohibition because they were there or their families were there. We'll have a moderator, Mr. Bo Simons from the Healdsburg Wine Museum, who will interview these 4 gentlemen. Mr. Bruno Butti, Mr. Frank Pastore, Joe Rocchioli, and one of our honored guests this evening, Lou Colombano. In addition to that, we'll have some other exhibits that will be here just for that one night. Mr. Simons from the Healdsburg Wine Library will bring some of their material up here, including a couple of rare books that are catalogs of wine bottles and paraphernalia that were sold nationwide. And the other gentleman is coming from San Anselmo in Marin County, and he is a collector of Prohibition paraphernalia, and he will have an exhibit just for that one night. So be sure to come on the 25th, which is a Tuesday at 7 o'clock. And of course, we'll have wine and snacks afterwards, as we will tonight. Let's see, what else do I have to say? I have to mention this exhibit on the wall, these 10 gorgeous pictures called The Enduring Spirit. They were just refurbished last week in Healdsburg, and this is the first time they've been shown in Cloverdale. And our guest speaker tonight will speak to that. The entire idea of the exhibit of these 10 photographs came about in 2006 by a woman who's here tonight, Gina Reiner. Would you please stand up, Gina? It was her inspiration and her idea to capture these 10 individuals and tell some of their life story. She did an oral history, is that correct? For Healdsburg?
For the 10 people.
For the 10 people. And out of that came the photographs.
Yes.
By our guest speaker tonight. And out of the photographs in 2009 came a book, which is why you're all here. Our guest speaker will speak to that book, and she will speak to what you see on the wall. Vivienne Sosnowski is with us this evening. She's born and educated in England. In her younger years, pardon me, Vivienne, she went to Canada, started her career in the newspaper business as an executive director and editor for 3 of the large newspapers in Canada. Then she came to the United States, went to work for the Washington, D.C. Examiner as an editor, and transferred out to California for the San Francisco Examiner, and became an editor there. And in 2009, because of what you see, those pictures on the wall, she decided she had to write this book about some of these individuals and about Prohibition in Sonoma County. Now that book has won a lot of awards. It was one of the top 50 books in the Bay Area for the Chronicle in 2009, a bestseller. It was recognized internationally by Gourmand International, a European magazine, as one of the best wine books for wine lovers in 2009. The Wine Spectator said that it was a good wine read in 2009. And the Sonoma County Historical Society gave it the Editor's Award for the best research for the history book in the year 2009. So with that, I would like to introduce, and would you please welcome Vivienne Sosnowski.
Thank you, Joaquin. I hope you can all hear me. I'll speak into this, but I have kind of a loud voice anyway, so if it just gets grating, let me know, and I won't use this as well. So, thank you all for coming tonight. It's a great joy to come up to Cloverdale because there's lots of Cloverdale in the book. Now, Joaquin has told you a little bit about how the book happened. Gina had this idea that she would like to record the lives of some important people in the wine community, and she talked to me about them, and I asked her if I could take the photos. So we worked together on this for some time, and it was a great joy, and we worked, I think everybody was over 95 or 94. Oh, I'm sorry, 92. We couldn't take anyone under that because there were so many people. So it was wonderful for me to see that so many people of that age still having a wonderful life and still had many stories to tell. And they would tell us a lot of stories while they were having their photographs taken, because it takes maybe sometimes an hour to get it really right. And so many told us stories about Prohibition, and I couldn't believe it. I was a newspaper editor and used to listening to people tell all kinds of stories about things going on in this country. But I hadn't anyone actually tell me real life stories about Prohibition. And I was flabbergasted, and I would say to people, boy, someone should write that down. That's our history. We cannot lose it. And I talked about that a couple of times, and one day I thought, you know what, Vivienne, no one's offered to write it down. You better write it down, because we mustn't forget the stories that have come before us, because there's still a lot to be learned from them. And also, Prohibition still affects our lives today. And I'll deal with that a little bit towards the end. So when I sat down to write the book, I thought, gee, I know quite a bit about Prohibition, you know, Al Capone, Chicago. And then I thought, you know what? I know absolutely nothing about what happened to wine in Prohibition. And I thought, well, that's a great starting point. Because I think most of us do know a lot about Prohibition, and probably in this room you know a lot more about Prohibition in Sonoma and Napa than I ever did. But I did a lot of work. I worked at the Library of Congress in Washington. I worked at the National Archives, both in Maryland and also in California. And lots of libraries, including Bo Simon's library, the Sonoma County Wine Library. People were wonderful to work with. And of course, I interviewed a lot of people around here. So let me just take you to one certain moment of when Prohibition started. Let's just imagine ourselves, it's January 16th, 1920. And Prohibition will start at midnight, 12:01, January 17th, 1920. Well, everyone here, and my book deals with Napa and Sonoma, which I call the premium wine counties of California. And everyone here was going crazy to try and deliver as much wine as they could, because as soon as 12:01 happened, they would never again be able to move their wine around or sell any wine until Prohibition was over. A lot of people here thought Prohibition wasn't going to last very long, and we'll get into that a little bit. But in the end, Prohibition lasted nearly 14 years, about a week, 3 weeks short of 14 years. It was a long, long time for these people to have their wine padlocked and their wineries closed. And you couldn't even leave your winery signs up. At 12:01, your signs had to be covered either with hardboard or black curtaining, but you couldn't even have your winery signs up anymore. That's how rigorous it was that day. Down in San Francisco, dozens of ships were trying to get out that evening through the Golden Gate to get into international waters before 12:01, because then the boats would have been stopped and the wine would have been confiscated. And that was an interesting thing to see, how huge a business wine was for California back in the day. It was, as you probably all know in this room, in the 1880s, it was big business. Even the New York Times sent a wine writer here in 1883, because wine was being sold across America, and people were interested in what were the best wines in Napa and Sonoma. And he visited many, many wineries, both in the two counties, and reported back on some of these great wines. And they were great wines. They won prizes around the world. They won prizes in Milan. They won prizes in Paris. They won prizes in Chicago. these counties made great wine for a long, long time. And many, many thousands of people were involved in the wine industry. And as you know, a lot of wine was taken from here and stored in San Francisco. During the 1906 earthquake, the Bunshaus lost 1 million gallons of wine in the earthquake. Asti, for some reason, its wine the wine tanks did not get cracked, and they kept all their wine. They were one of the few people that still had wine in San Francisco, and they really made a packet during that period because wine prices obviously went up. But it was a big, big business, and it wasn't just a few farmers, as I thought it might have been at one time, making a little bit of wine for their friends and maybe a few stores. The wine went to France, it went to England, it went to South America, it went to Japan, it went to China. It was a big industry, and that's why it's interesting to see, how that industry could come to a grinding halt on that day. In San Francisco, people got everything they could together to try and buy enough wine. Their hearses were out packed with wine. People riding all kinds of carriages they hadn't got out for years and years. The whole city was just moving wine around, and here the roads were busy, the afternoon, people were trying to get wine out of here. So the police decided that at 11:30 they were going to stop all wine movements because they wanted to make sure everyone was off the roads by 12:01, which increased the amount of grumbling around here. People were pretty mad by that time. So how did we get prohibition? I think you probably all understand the 18th Amendment and know about that, especially if you've been watching the Ken Burns project, which is great. But what happened with wine during that period? There had always been a prohibition movement in California, which I was surprised about. But it got great strength during the gold rush because down out in the towns of gold rush, people got drunk, they had a lot of money, and a lot of women, especially in churches, saw that it created a great deal of danger to the people living there. So there were prohibition movements up in the gold country. There was also the first prohibition group was in San Francisco, which surprised me. So there was a movement, and the churches all tithed people for money to fight alcohol. On the other side, the beer makers and beer producers of California all tithed everyone who had a tavern. You had to pay a portion of your rent. The whiskey makers also, the alcohol producers also had a tithe, and they put together funds to fight in Congress. And the wine people also made a very small tithe. But the wine people generally didn't think that prohibition was going to hurt them. They thought prohibition was going to be about the saloons and about whiskey. And nobody could believe here that they were going to stop making wine. I mean, wine was healthy. Wine was not bad for you. So they did not raise a lot of money. And the other thing that people say about that time is, if the three forces, the beer, the whiskey and alcohol makers and the wine people had got together, they might have been able to do something against prohibition, but they would not join because they weren't interested. The whiskey makers wanted the beer to go down so they'd sell more whiskey. The beer makers wanted whiskey to go down so they'd sell more beer. And the winemakers really weren't cognizant of the danger to themselves. So there was a state initiative in 1914, 1916, 1918 about prohibition. And in every single time it got voted down. But there was a real delineation in the state here between North and South. So while it just squeaked through in the South, it was always like heavily won in the North. So it would be like 16-1 in San Francisco against prohibition. But just it would sneak through by like 2,000 votes in Southern California. So there was a real breakdown of support, and the Central Valley, they also voted for prohibition. And this came back to haunt them a little bit later on. They had nothing to do or no concern for the people who were growing wine grapes in the northern part of the country, of the state. And there were a lot of people that believed prohibition was not a good idea. But even so, there were people in Sonoma and Napa that voted for prohibition, but very few, like, maybe 200 out of 8,000, but there were some. So anyway, the prohibition initiatives were defeated, but that was statewide. And then in Congress, the voting went through for the 18th Amendment, and it went out, because back in the day there were 48 states, it went out to the rest of the country, it had to be ratified. Well, people didn't think California would ratify it, but it went through a couple of states, and 36 out of 48 states had to ratify it. What happened then was, all of a sudden, the governor of California, Governor Stevens, said California is pro-prohibition. And everybody in California said, well, what? We have never ever voted for prohibition. It has never received a plurality. But he had run on a prohibition platform, and he said, too bad, that was part of my platform, and California is voting for prohibition. So there we were, all thrown into the same pot as everyone else. There's a lovely quote from Clarence Lee was the congressman for this area during the fight for that. And he stood up, and he used to be the DA in Santa Rosa. He made the most wonderful impassioned speeches about why prohibition shouldn't happen, and why the winemakers and the grape growers of California should not be impacted. And he said in one speech, he said, you know, this was the fall before prohibition started, he said, we have hanging on our vines today the greatest harvest of grapes ever in the state of California. And what is to become of it? And he made another point too. It was just at the end of the First World War, and a lot of people here had sent their sons up to war, and some had not come back. And he said, it's against everything we fought for that we would not have the freedoms that we believed, that we went out and fought, for then. And in fact, 100 Italian winemakers met in Healdsburg in 1918 and sent a letter to President Hoover saying to him, you know, we have always stood up for you. We have raised a lot of money for the First World War and with bonds, and they did not get a reply from him. They actually in the end sent a petition with 1,000 names on it, and no response came. So here we are. I've taken you to the night of Prohibition before it starts. Let me take you back a couple of weeks, maybe a month or two before that. People are starting to panic. The harvest is coming in, the greatest harvest ever in California. They don't know what to do with it. And they've asked, and the State Agricultural Commissioner said, you know, you just might as well just pull out all those grapes. It's just a waste of time. And people were saying, well, what should we do? And agricultural officers were saying, well, grow something else. And people were saying, well, what else do you grow on that land? It's not, you can't be starting other things. And he said, one guy said, now, you know, what has happened here is, it's like asking a physician to become a lawyer next week. You know, what we know is how to grow grapes and how to make wine. It's what we know. So people were panicking. They didn't know what they were going to do to make a living. And some of these people were already third-generation winemakers, and it was their absolute livelihood. And they noticed one day that a few salesmen were coming through the area. These salesmen started to come from New York. They started to come from Chicago. They were coming here to buy wine grapes. And all of a sudden, there was just a race for wine grapes. And you all know the reason why is that someone discovered that, yes, you can make 200 gallons of wine per household in the States without paying taxes. And that was a loophole that, from a law that long before the 18th Amendment that they hadn't fixed in the 18th Amendment. And they never did fix it, which is interesting to me. So you could make 200 gallons of wine, and of course people in cities all around the country wanted to make their own wine, especially where there was an immigrant population. They all knew how to make wine. The only city that never did buy wine grapes was New Orleans. New Orleans used to make its wine during Prohibition with raisins. They had no basements to store it because of the water there. And they used to dye it red. It came out a funny color. They dyed it red with food dyes to make it look like wine. But every other city took a lot. So all of a sudden you saw the prices for wine grapes going up. They had been like $15 a ton. They went 50, 75, 100. They went up in the first year to something like $250 a ton. And people around here said, geez, if this is prohibition, bring it on. You could hardly get a train out here. There were so few trains compared to the amount of grapes that needed to go out east to the Midwest. There were about 100 rail cars a day in New York City of wine grapes being sold. It was the biggest market. It was a fair amount of wine grapes. But all through Chicago and Philadelphia and Boston, anywhere there was an immigrant population, and soon anywhere people could go to the library and buy a book on making wine, although some libraries in the States decided to take the wine-making books out of the library because they thought that would be a difficult thing to support. So we found within 2 or 3 years, people were making a lot of money. People had to work hard. They had to pick the grapes. They had to put them in lugs and little boxes. They had to wrap them up in paper. It was a little bit different. And really, you know, in the long run, the profit is in the wine. It's not in the grape. But there was such a demand at first for the grape. In Roseville, you know, just near Sacramento, they had to put in a special icing operation because the grapes were iced. Here, they were iced about 4 times again as they went across the country because obviously it was really hot weather and they needed to be kept very, very fresh. They would put, you know, thousands of gallons of tons of ice went out from Roseville every day, and these trains just endlessly going across the country. There were bitter battles between the people of Washington State with apples and the Imperial Valley who had cantaloupes. There weren't enough trains to go around, so it was whoever knew the best congressman was getting the trains to them. But I did hear stories about people sitting and waiting with their grapes at the little train stations along here, 3 or 4 days. We all know what that would do to, you know, ripe grapes that are waiting to leave. So things went well for a while, and then we saw the Central Valley that had voted against prohibition suddenly looked north and saw all the money being made in Sonoma and Napa, and they decided they would start pulling out their table grapes. At first they just sold Thompson grapes down to make wine. But the people down east were a bit smarter than that, and they wanted mostly Alicante Boucher because it made a good red wine, not a great tasting wine, but it made good wine for people who weren't very used to making wine and weren't very, very skilled at it. And the brand they loved was called Baby. And so people would write Baby on their lugs, the boxes of grapes, even though they weren't baby grapes at all. So they were doing, still doing well, but the amount of grapes that were being, wine grapes that were being planted in the Central Valley was astounding. I think you all know that I think at the beginning of Prohibition, there was something like 98,000 acres of grapes in the state of California, wine grapes, and at the end of Prohibition, there was about 180, so nearly double. So you have a sense, you know, I always thought that the vineyards would be, you know, just left to rot and the grapes rotting. That is not true for the beginning. At the beginning, they couldn't plant them fast enough and they couldn't pick them fast enough. So what happened to this wonderful scenario? What happened was the Central Valley started to send too many grapes out. And so there started to become a backlog. Trainloads of grapes would arrive in the big cities like New York, would sit for 2 or 3 weeks in the sun. Of course, we know what that would result in. And one of the things that was very difficult was, and a lot of people might not have spoken the language well and didn't really understand the contracts when they sent the grapes down east. If the grapes were found to be not in great condition when they got there, they were responsible for the cost of transportation. And the Domenicali family, which I think you know, they had had a bumpy ride into Prohibition. When Prohibition started, they had 50,000 gallons of wine. Just before it started, they had 50,000 gallons of wine. A guy from New York came and said, I'll buy the whole lot. And all of a sudden, Prohibition happened. So they have 50,000 gallons of wine just sitting there in a tank, padlocked. So they decided they would sell their wine grapes the next year. They sent their wine grapes. They sent 12 tons. The first, and the wine grape buyers, they say, it's great, you're really early, you're going to do really well. they send 12 tons, they get back a check for 17 cents because they went bad, and that's all that there was for money. So that, the over-explosion of wine grape growing happened about the same time as like 1925, 1926. We're 5 or 6 years into Prohibition, and the Depression is beginning to start, and people down east don't have as much money to spend on wine. And frankly, a lot of them have made a lot of wine because it's a revolving door. You make 200, you sell 200. You know, especially if you're a bootlegger, that law was a great boon to bootleggers. So things start to become difficult. There starts to be a lot of crime. About 1926, the government has a big judiciary committee in Congress about how Prohibition is going. And people are just up in arms about it. There's a lot of crime caused by Prohibition agents. There were only 2,300 Prohibition agents in this country. You can just imagine how they were spread around. I mean, all the people that had to work at night around Bodega Bay and all up the coast, there were not enough people to go around. And most of them were appointees of friends or political appointees, and they were known as a gang of thugs. There were so many of them put in jail for extortion, for crime, for stealing. A lot of the wine that was kept under padlock in the government's own stocks vanished because they were taking it all. The crime was rampant and people wanted to stop that. But the Judiciary Committee decided Prohibition was doing very well and they weren't going to interrupt it at all. What happened after that is that most people in this county that had any wine were bootleggers. And people of the time told me that nobody thought bootlegging was bad here. Bootlegging was, selling wine was what they always did, and you just signed something and didn't make it illegal. I think everybody I couldn't find a soul who hadn't bootlegged. It was just something that everybody did. And they started to go to jail because they did get caught. Not all the time. There were lots and lots of stills here making all kinds of liquor. But when they were caught, they were sent to Sacramento, and then they were sent to the jailhouse in Santa Rosa. And the third floor of the Santa Rosa jail was known as Bootlegger's Floor. And the Bootlegger's Floor was busy. And Jean Cuneo, who was a wonderful grape grower, his father went in there for 3 months because his father had been found with hidden brandy underneath his garage. They were taking brandy. People tried to make brandy from their grapes because it's so much easier to take down to San Francisco. So anyway, they had a bunch of brandy hidden under the garage, and they hadn't been watching well enough, so someone was usually standing on guard to tell them, close those doors. Anyway, his dad went to jail for 3 months. But he could go anytime he wanted, and he always took 2 small bottles of brandy. One he put in the sheriff's desk on the way up, and the other one he took up to his dad, so his dad could always have a drink. And they could all have a drink, and in fact they all had great food because there was occasionally syndicates would come here, and it wasn't just the people that lived here, but syndicates, otherwise known as gangs and crime bosses from San Francisco, came up and would borrow someone's barn and put in a big still. In fact, we have someone here whose parents had a big still, and I'll introduce it to him in a second when I get there. And they always tried to choose barns that would buy water. Obviously, you need a lot of water to run a still. And so this guy this guy was supposed to have one of the biggest stills in Sonoma County. He also ran a resort in Healdsburg, which was known as a place where you could meet women who were not your wives. It was a very busy place at some time. Anyway, he was caught. He was taken into jail. I think he got 6 months. But the sheriff found out that he was a really good cook. And he said, I need a good cook for these guys. They're used to eating well. And we like to have good food around here generally. So he gave this guy a car that he had taken from another bootlegger. And he said, now every day go out and will you just, do the shopping and come back? Well, he would head out to Alexander Valley every day, visit with friends, have a few drinks, get some more wine, go to a few farmhouses, get some some chickens and some vegetables, and then drive back into Santa Rosa towards the end of the day and make dinner for the men who were in the bootleggers' floor. So it was tough being in the jail, but it wasn't as hard as it might have been. So when we get into like 1928 and 1929, we have a real problem in the courts of this country. They are packed with trying to deal with lawbreakers of either bootleggers or someone that's doing something with liquor that they shouldn't be doing. And judges said they were throwing up their hands. They could not get civil cases through the court system. They could not get other criminal cases like murders through the court system. It was absolutely jammed, and people were getting charged with liquor offenses all the time. It was almost impossible to find a place where you could not buy a drink in the United States. And especially around here, there was a street dance in Healdsburg one night, and all the bottles were left around the street, and people were complaining, "You can get a drink any way you want," and everyone went, "Yes, it's wine country." So it got very difficult for the law enforcement authorities, and it got very difficult for the courts. And people started to become very poor because of the Depression. And people started to remember, especially the unions were always against prohibition. They thought it was a man's right or a woman's right to have a drink whenever you wanted. And they went to Congress regularly. And we're talking about the major unions of this country. They were absolutely, absolutely against prohibition. They started to make more fuss because they knew how many people work in the three liquor industries, the beer, whiskey, and alcohol, and hard alcohol and wine. The thousands of people that make the bottles, the labels, the draymen, the carters. There's a lot of people. There were thousands of jobs at stake. And by the time Hoover was up for re-election and he was up against Roosevelt, he decided he wasn't going to get rid of prohibition. And Roosevelt came out with a platform that said, "I am going to fix prohibition." And all of a sudden Hoover thought, "I better get on that wagon because it seems popular." The Hearst newspapers have done a lot, and they have papers all across the country. So we get to the election, and of course, even in California, and Hoover, as you know, from Palo Alto, even in California, Roosevelt wins the election, probably over prohibition. And they get people back to work again in this area. So we're into January 1933, and prohibition is going to end in December, and everybody knows it's going to end in December. The people here have already planted, so they've taken off grapes this year thinking that they are going to make wine. They're making wine. But they can't do anything with that wine, obviously, it's not time. And the government says, you can now sell liquor in the States starting in April, but it's only going to be 3.2% wine. Well, everybody here just threw up their hands and said, "Well, what would that be?" And some people said, "We're not doing that because it will create the wrong impression about what wine is." But a lot of people in this area did, a lot of winemakers and wineries did. They mixed it with soda water, and they sold it like, it was called sparkling claret, it was a very popular one. Wine people complained it doesn't taste like wine, it's sweet, we can imagine what it would taste like if you put that much wine in. But at last they were taking the padlocks off their wineries. And just to go back, during Prohibition, why the book is called When the Rivers Ran Red, it's because so many wineries had to lose their wine, either because they had done something wrong and they lost their wine as a penalty, like the Segazios, that's what happened to them, or like the Fopianos, they lost over 100,000 gallons. Their wine just became bad after 7 years of Prohibition, and you had to call the Prohibition agents in. They came up in a car from San Francisco with guns in their belt, and they would turn the taps. So they'd either put a hose or they'd turn the taps on your tanks, and it would all run out. I mean, such an environmental disaster. The dry creek sometimes ran red for a long time. Orchards vanished. It would run down the hills and into the streams. People lost their vegetable gardens. It was just a mess. And every day in the newspapers you'll read, 50,000 gallons here, 40,000 gallons. It just went on and on, this wine just pouring out. And in fact, in Healdsburg, in the Russian River, they said that, and I think it was the Segasio dumping, that the river did run red one day and killed all the fish. You can just imagine that. One of the saddest things about Prohibition was they poisoned liquor. The government poisoned liquor so that people wouldn't drink it. But people still drank it, and people stole it and sold it to others. So that wonderful veterans home in Yountville, for instance, the dietitian and a bunch of patients there all died from alcohol poisoning, and it was a terrible, terrible death. And just before Prohibition ended, a young boy in Santa Rosa, he was a star football player, he came home and he couldn't see, and the paralysis, finally he survived. But this was where the government actually poisoned the liquor, so if you drank it, there were so many, hundreds of poisonings, especially in San Francisco. So we saw a real revulsion against the government and the things that it did. Anyway, on December 5th, 1933, Prohibition was declared done. And Lou Colombano, here with us today, he actually was in Asti the day that it ended. And Asti got all these trains that came in, and they covered them in colored bunting, and asked all the children from the local school here to dress in the red, white, and green of Swiss Italy. And they had this huge party. Pathé News was there. We were just talking about we should try and find that film. And the wife of the manager of Asti Winery, she broke a bottle of champagne, and the train went to the south, and Prohibition was over. But Prohibition created a number of problems, and my book doesn't deal with that, because I wanted to end it at the end of Prohibition. One is that people didn't really like wine at the end of Prohibition because they'd all drunk wine they'd made themselves, and it was horrible also, as you can imagine. People are learning out of a book, they're buying old grapes. And the government, about 2 years after Prohibition, started to do a big advertising program to tell people, you know what, wine is a good thing, it's good to drink. Because people had to try to taste the cocktails during Prohibition. And cocktails are easy to mix up, and it's, you can get a lot of oomph in one bottle, and they really cared for that. And you look back and think about how many years people were drinking just cocktails because they couldn't get their hands on good wine. And I think it probably took 30 or 40 years for this industry to recover from Prohibition. The other reason why it took a long time was at the end of Prohibition, we were far behind the other countries that hadn't had Prohibition. France had been able to continue its grape growing, its new trellising, changing tanks, not using old redwood. Same in Australia. They had taken over a lot of the contracts around the world that California used to have. And when I talked to Lou Forpiano, he said, they had to go steam their old redwood tanks to use them again. It was a long time before they could get into modern tanks and modern trellising. Nobody had any capital. They'd all been poor. So the results have hung around for a long, long time. But it still was 14 very, very difficult years. And although, there are a lot of really funny stories about Prohibition, it was really a difficult time for people here because they did not want to lose their land if they couldn't pay their taxes. And these were hard-working people. And when I talked to most of them, it wasn't the fact they couldn't sell their wine, it was just the insult of knowing they had been turned into criminals by their own government. And that's what lingered the longest time in all their minds. So, if you have any questions, I'd be happy to try and answer them. Go ahead.
Yes, was there any exceptions for sacramental wine, and were they able to have a small market for that?
There was sacramental wine I thought would be a really big deal, but at the end it didn't turn out. It turned out to be about 8 million gallons a year. But before Prohibition, it was 1 million gallons. So you can see that people went to church a lot more during Prohibition. It was not everybody could get a license to do it. One of the most interesting stories is Beaulieu Vineyard. Now Beaulieu, for some reason that I have never been able to figure out, and the Archdiocese of San Francisco let me go through all their papers, trying to figure out why they had got the stamp of approval from the Archbishop of San Francisco as being the person, being the place where everybody in the state should go to get their sacramental wine. And he also, the Archbishop also sent his second in command to supervise the making of it. I don't know what, we couldn't figure out what the relationship was, but there was one little twist to that. Next to Beaulieu Vineyard used to be this huge agricultural school run by the Roman Catholic Church in San Francisco, where they would send the boys in the summer to learn agricultural skills, thinking those were a good thing to teach them. And they were. Those schools were good. They did train boys well, I have to say. They all had to read before they left. And there were a lot of orphans in San Francisco. People would go out to, out to mine or do whatever and just leave their children behind. It was a different day. Anyway, and it's in their, I've got their documents, in some of their advertising documents, they used the labor of the boys of the agricultural school at Beaulieu Vineyard to make their wine. But generally it wasn't a great deal of wine. It was, as many Jewish people used sacramental wine as Roman Catholics. And a lot of people were fake rabbis in New York. You see the stores, this big rabbi here, and there was never a rabbi. But they did find one guy in New York City, so it was at about 8 million gallons. They found one guy in New York City who was signing the permits. And when they stopped him, he was a city guy, they stopped him, the amount of sacramental wine used in North America, in the States, dropped by a half. He must have been very wealthy for the payoffs that he took. I could not find his name, but I swear it'd be another book if I could.
Any other questions?
Yeah, I know. Do you see any parallels between the prohibition of alcohol back in the 20s and the prohibition on drugs today?
I can't really speak to that because I haven't really got into that. Some people have said that, they do, but, I'm not an expert on that. I just did the one thing. Anyone else?
Feel free. Must be some other questions out there.
Well, we do have some books. And I'll be around for a little while if anyone has a question. And oftentimes I come to places like this and people actually have great stories for me. So if you do have a story, let me know.
I'm going to get the book.
Thank you, Vivienne. I want to tell you,